There are two interrelated yet conceptually distinguishable concerns that sparked the foundation of sociology in the 19th century: poverty and inequality. Of course, poverty and inequality existed before, but they were never as pronounced and systematic as in the beginning of the industrial age. Workers lived in overcrowded quarters with poor health conditions, and those who became unable to perform wage labor had no social securities to fall back on. Poverty did not just threaten the well-being of the working class, but also their capacity to perform labor for the capitalists. The extent of human suffering concerned social reformers and researchers whose activities would eventually be called sociology. With regard to rural sociology, some of the first activities of the discipline coalesced in the country life movement, an early 20th century effort to overcome rural poverty and what was perceived as underdevelopment. What exactly is poverty? The government and economic research institutes use a variety of econometric measures based on data from the formal economy to define a poverty line, such as the annual income of a household. But people's experience of poverty doesn't always match these definitions. There are people who are considered poor, but who live a perfectly happy life. There are people that exceed the official poverty line by a few pennies, but who live in expensive cities and struggle to participate in the social life around them. Schaft and Brown define poverty as the systematic lack of sufficient social, political, or economic resources that enable persons, families, or households to access basic sustenance or participate fully in society. Generally speaking, poverty is an experience of deprivation, but its specific phase is too case-specific and multidimensional to be narrowed down to a number like the poverty line. There are two important factors that determine the individual experience of poverty: the resources available to us and the culture around us. Let's start with resources. We learned that wealth depends on people's ability to draw from the entire substantive economy, not just the measures of the formal economy. It is easy to see how substantive poverty is not just a matter of lacking income, but also other resources to fall back on. When modern life means that we no longer have the land nor the skills to feed ourselves, and our relationships to friends, families, and neighbors are less dependable than they once were, perhaps money becomes the pivotal benchmark of poverty. On the other hand, even affluent people struggle to satisfy non-material subsistence needs, such as genuine human connection or spiritual fulfillment, something that money cannot buy. For them, the iceberg of the substantive economy is top-heavy, an abundance of money, but a poverty of robust connections to community and nature. In short, we must look at the entire substantive economy to describe poverty, and what constitutes rich versus poor lives cannot be measured by a universal yardstick. But the experience of poverty also depends on the culture we live in. If you live in an area where the cheapest meal in any restaurant is $20, you feel poor quicker because you can't afford to go out with your friends or do other things that people around you normally do. If you live in a society in which social status is linked to conspicuous consumption, you feel poor quicker than if the fun thing to do among your friends is to sit around a fire and share stories. What matters to most people in their daily lives is not so much the absolute value of their assets or their income, as long as their subsistence needs are met, but their ability to participate in the social life around them. The idea that our social environment shapes our perception of poverty is invoked in the distinction between absolute and relative poverty. Absolute poverty defines a fixed economic benchmark below people are considered poor. Relative poverty, on the other hand, puts that benchmark in relation to the income or wealth of people of a reference group. Using a relative measure of poverty, someone could be considered poor if they are below, say, 60% of the median income of their country or local community. And that leads us to the related issue of inequality. From a purely economic perspective, inequality and poverty don't need to go hand in hand. If we think of poverty as a minimal level of consumption, then we could just grow the economy for everyone. The richer get richer, the poorer get richer, and eventually no one needs to starve and everyone can afford a smartphone. This, in essence, is capitalism's promise to the poor. No economic system drives growth like capitalism, they say. And while some profit more than others, this part is usually brushed over, everybody will be better off. There's also a line in old-school conservatism that sees it as the obligation of the wealthy to remedy the material hardships of the poor. This belief is perhaps most famously expressed by steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, who shared that the man who dies thus rich dies disgraced. These sentiments have either been religiously motivated as acts of charity, or practically, because a hungry and sick worker is a bad worker. A hungry worker is also an angry worker, so capitalists have often tried to preempt social unrest by providing workers and the unemployed with minimal social protections. Karl Polanyi spoke in this context of capitalism's double movement, a cycle of aggressive accumulation of capital on the one hand and the establishment of social protections on the other. Generally speaking, companies and their allies in the state seek to increase capital accumulation by lowering wages and cutting social welfare programs. But at some point, the labor conditions of the working class become too unbearable to ignore, so new social protections are implemented to quell large-scale unrest. Whether religiously or practically motivated, these approaches to poverty reduction share that they do not seek to overcome inequality. The transactions to the poor are never big enough for the poor to become independent from wage work. But inequality also has an ethical component that many find reprehensible. Just as some think of inequality as a natural, perhaps God-given, but certainly acceptable social order, others think it violates the moral principle that all people should have equal rights and opportunities. It doesn't surprise that Karl Marx's critique of the inequality between the capitalists and the workers became popular in the 19th century, only a few decades after the world has seen major revolutions in the name of egalitarianism, such as the American and French revolutions. But these revolutions failed to guarantee economic equality, which resulted in an ever-growing gap of opportunities. But it isn't just socialists who decry inequality. For instance, there have always been strands in most religions that condemn inequality. There's a line in Christianity, for instance, that regards inequality as a violation of the principle that all people should be able to live dignified lives, and that regards wanting more than one's share as greed, one of the 7 deadly sins. But besides the ethical question whether inequality is acceptable or not, there are also practical concerns that indicate that we cannot address material poverty without considering inequality. For instance, it is well established that childhood family income, educational attainment, and life outcomes are highly correlated. And it is relative childhood family income in comparison to others that counts. Someone who attends an underfunded public school has a harder time to compete for well-paid jobs than someone whose parents were wealthy enough to send them to a private prep school. Inequality also leads to residential segregation, where affluent people live among themselves and so do the poor, and each community comes with uneven opportunities to learn, grow, invest, make a living. Without addressing these inequalities, for instance, it is hard to see how people are supposed to work themselves up out of poverty. Sure, it is possible for individuals, but all other things being equal, people from disadvantaged backgrounds will only be able to compete for well-paying jobs or other resources if those who own considerably more resources give up their relative advantages. Sociologists as well as economists find that inequality perpetuates itself. Indeed, inequality in the US has risen steadily over the last decades, while social mobility, the ability to improve one's economic situation and social status over one's lifetime, has decreased. To demonstrate, based on data from the US Census Bureau, the Pew Research Center reports that the income earned by the top 20% of earners of all US income has increased from 43% in 1968 to 50% in 2018. On the other hand, the chances of a 30-year-old to out-earn their parents have steadily declined since the 1940s. What then is the solution to poverty? In terms of purely material needs, the capitalist promise of economic growth for everyone would be one. If we all get richer, then we can satisfy everyone's material needs. But there are 3 problems. First, in an unequal world, the capital gains of economic growth are also unequally distributed. This is why the income and wealth gap has increased over the last decades, while the wealth of the middle class has mostly stagnated, and the poorest percent of a population generally benefits the least from additional economic growth. Second, people need more than just bread. We saw earlier that the experience of poverty greatly hinges on their ability to participate in social life. But if the wealth gap widens, the poorest part of the population are more and more excluded from the social life of the wealthier classes. Finally, people also have a need for self-actualization. If inequality deprives them of both economic opportunity and political power, this need is impossible to satisfy. Therefore, strategies to fight poverty need to fight inequality as well. How can this be done? Redistribution of income of wealth. For example, through progressive income and property taxes, inheritance tax, land reform, or nationalization. Pick your flavor. Okay, so poverty and inequality go hand in hand, but we must not make the mistake to reduce poverty to a simplistic class struggle between the capital owners and everyone else. As Brown and Schaft point out, poverty has distinct patterns shaped by geography, gender, race, and ability. For instance, we know that women and people of color are more likely to be poor than men and white folks, and that rural people are more likely to be poor than people who live in metropolitan areas. We also know that the experience of being poor is different from rural to urban areas. While some characteristics of rural communities can offset the effects of poverty, such as closer community ties and access to land or game for self-provisioning, others make being poor in rural areas harder, such as the considerably higher cost of transportation and a thin network of public services. I ask you to read Brown and Schaft's chapter, which gives a good overview about just how poverty pans out in rural areas. In this lecture, I was only able to scratch the surface of the concept of poverty and how it shapes society. I left the discussion of rural poverty to Brown and Schaft, simply because I felt that we had to go over some of the basics of poverty and inequality first. We'll pick up with rural poverty and how it relates to health when we meet in class next week. So long, and thanks for all the fish.